We're now going to talk about phylum Chordata, and this is going to be the phylum that humans are found in. And so this is going to be the only group that we are going to actually go and look at the actual classes that are in phylum Chordata. So up until this point, we've kind of stuck with kingdoms, and so right now we're in Kingdom Animalia. We're now going to talk about phylum Chordata, and within phylum Chordata, we're going to talk about the different classes that are in here. So that's a different classification. So most of the animals we're going to talk about today are considered vertebrates, and they are going to include humans and fish, birds, reptiles, things like this. And we're going to have a couple different characteristics that are going to make vertebrates vertebrates. So all vertebrates are going to have what we call an endoskeleton. And so this is going to be a skeleton that is on the interior, unlike something like an arthropod, which is, includes things like insects, which have an exoskeleton. So now the endoskeleton is on the inside. This is something that we share with echinoderms. Now the vertebrate endoskeleton is also going to be unique because it has a skull and a backbone. And so the backbone is going to be a series of bones, which we call vertebra, which is where the name vertebrates are going to come from. So here is an image of a snake, and you can see many vertebra. So snakes have many more vertebra than we have in our body. There's going to be a skull, and then kind of this endoskeleton that's going to help provide attachment sites for muscles that are going to allow for kind of very diverse types of locomotion. So for example, a snake is going to have no limbs, but it's going to be able to move and navigate in its ecosystem based on kind of its shape. So in phylum Chordata, we are going to have 4 key characteristics that have to be present at some point in the life of this animal. And so this can be during the embryonic stage, so when they're in utero kind of, or in an egg, or it can happen during adulthood, but it has to be present at some point in the life of this animal in order to be considered a chordate. So here are the 4 things. The first is a dorsal hollow nerve cord. We then have a notochord, pharyngeal slits, and a postanal tail. And I will describe what each of these things are on the next slide. So here we have an image of kind of our stereotypical chordate with all of the 4 characteristics that are necessary to be in phylum Chordata. So we're going to go through these 4 characteristics, and again, these have to be present at some point in the lifetime of a chordate. Many times it's going to be during the embryonic stage, but it also can show up in the adult form in some of the groups. Now the first structure is the notochord, and this is going to be a cartilaginous rod that is going to help kind of support the embryonic body and will also provide support in some of the chordate adult bodies, depending on the group we're talking about. Now this is going to help protect and support the spine initially. So this is actually beneath our neck structure, which is the dorsal hollow nerve cord. Now the dorsal hollow nerve cord is going to become the spinal cord and the brain. And so initially it is kind of just this nerve cord that then will have to kind of become specialized in different regions and will ultimately become kind of the central nervous system for an organism. The next structures are pharyngeal slits, and all chordate embryos will have these, and they will become different structures depending on the organism. So for example, these pharyngeal slits will become gill arches in fish. So they will actually act as kind of the breathing mechanism for some fish. In humans, they will actually turn into part of kind of the ear bones for us. Okay, so they do not provide, we don't have gills as adults, so we lose those, and they're going to turn into kind of something else like our inner ear bones. The last structure is a postanal tail, and so this is going to mean a tail that is going to extend past the anus. And so if you think about lots of animals like cats and dogs, they have this tail that they have, some types of monkeys have it. We no longer have of postanal tail in adulthood, but we do have it as an embryo, but it does eventually disappear. Sometimes it will show up in a few cases in humans, and usually those humans will have that part taken off because we don't really need a tail at this point. Okay, another main kind of characteristic of chordates is going to be body segmentation. So body segmentation is something that we've seen in groups like the annelids, where you kind of have these segmented parts of the body. It's a little more difficult to see this in chordates, but it is there. And so you can actually see this in the backbone of vertebrates. So the vertebral column is going to have these kind of segments, repeated units. And then also how kind of muscles are arranged are also going to be in segments. So the first group of chordates we're going to talk about are the invertebrates. And so these are going to be the most different from the rest of the groups that we're going to talk about today. So these two groups are going to be the tunicates and the lancets. And what it means that they're invertebrates is that they do not have a vertebral column or a backbone like we do. Okay. However, they are going to retain the 4 basic characteristics that all chordates have to have, and that's why they're included in the chordates. Now here is a phylogenetic tree that is showing the chordates. We just briefly saw the lancets and tunicates. Those are kind of a group that we're not really going to talk about very much at all. They're invertebrates. But the rest of the groups that we're going to talk about are going to be the vertebrates. And so if you can see on this image, we are going to have kind of the evolution of a vertebral column right here. So all the rest of the organisms are going to have a vertebral column or a backbone. Okay, we're going to start off with a group that are going to include the hagfish and lampreys. These are Agnatha. We're then going to start to talk about groups that have jaws. So this is kind of the next evolutionary step, where we have the evolution of a jaw structure. We then are going to talk about the evolution of legs and the evolution of amniotic egg. And so we'll discuss all of those very important steps in the evolution of the chordates. The first group of vertebrates on the planet are going to be these aquatic fish that evolved during the early Cambrian period about 542 million years ago. So these fish will have a vertebral column. However, they are not going to have jaws. So they are going to be different from our kind of modern day fish that we think of that have jaws. However, there are some representatives of jawless fish that still live today, and these are going to be the hagfish and the lamprey. Now the pictures you see on the slide are kind of reconstructions of what we think these very early vertebrates would have looked like. Now the living examples of the jawless fish are going to be in a group called Agnatha. And Agnatha is going to include 2 different groups, the lampreys and the hagfish. Lampreys are going to be jawless fish that are going to mostly be parasites, so they will actually kind of use their mouth as a sucker. They'll attach on to the side of a fish and will basically be kind of like a leech, if you know what a leech is. And they're going to stick on there and suck the blood of some organism. The next group are going to be hagfish, and hagfish are kind of these scavengers that will search the deep and dark sea floor for any dead or decaying material, animals, and then feed on that. Something interesting that hagfish do is that they have this kind of slime that they will excrete as a kind of mechanism to avoid predation. So if they don't want to be eaten, they will kind of release this mucus. And there was this wreck on some highway a couple years ago where a big truck carrying a ton of hagfish got in an accident, and the hagfish actually kind of fell out of the actual truck and covered all the other cars in the road with tons of slime. And so you can see a picture of that there with that car, and just destroyed it. And so obviously the hagfish did not enjoy being in a car accident and kind of had this predator defense mechanism and released all this slime. All right, so now that we have the jawless fish out of the way, so our hagfish and lamprey, we are now going to move on to our first groups that are going to have jaws. And so from this period on, every animal we talk about is going to have a jaw. It may not be exactly like our jaw, but it's going to be a jaw because this is the next big evolutionary step. So we're now going to talk about both the bony fish and the cartilaginous fish. And so this word ichthyes means fish. So we're going to talk about chondrichthyes, which are cartilaginous fish, or osteichthyes, which are going to be bony fish. Okay, so chond means cartilage and oste means bone. And so if you have the word ichthyes, ichthyes means fish. So if you're an ichthyologist, you study fish. Okay, so I just want you to become familiar with this term, and then you can know, if it's a cartilaginous fish or chondrichthyes or osteichthyes, you'll be able to understand what that is. So there are two major groups of the living fish, and they are going to be the cartilaginous fish, or those chondrichthyes. They're going to include things like sharks and rays, and they are going to have a skeleton that is composed of cartilage. So instead of having kind of bones like we do, they're going to have cartilage. So you can feel the tip of your nose or your ear, that's cartilage. And so the actual sharks and rays are going to have skeletons made out of that flexible material. The next group are going to be the bony fish, and they are going to have skeletons that are what we typically think of a skeleton as something that's kind of hard and reinforced with calcium. So this is going to be kind of a strong material. It's not as flexible as cartilage, but it's going to kind of reinforce the structures for the bodies. So these two different groups, and their official names are chondrichthyes and osteichthyes. So the chondrichthyes, so here's how you spell chondrichthyes. These are going to be your sharks, your rays, and your skates. So skate is a type of chondrichthy. One thing that's interesting about this group is, again, they have cartilaginous skeleton, but they also have kind of these little teeth-like structures on their skin surface, which makes them extremely streamlined in one direction. But if you were to rub your hand in the opposite direction of the teeth, you would actually feel kind of little sharp edges. And one of the image in the middle shows kind of how the teeth that are on the skin of the chondrichthyes are actually arranged in a very specific structure. The next group, these osteichthyes, so these are the bony fish, are going to include two different categories of bony fish. So we're going to have what we call the ray fin fishes, and these are going to be, I think most people's, when you think of a fish, this is what most people are thinking of. These are going to be things like tuna, trout, clownfish, things like that. Okay, so they have kind of these different fins that are going to kind of have these structures that are going to kind of radiate out and provide kind of a surface for them to use for swimming. The second group are called low fin fishes, and you can have either something like a lungfish, which is kind of this bottom picture right here. This is a lungfish. Or you can have a coelacanth, which is going to be a deep sea dweller, which is the kind of bottom right image. They were thought to be extinct because they live so deep down in the ocean, it's kind of hard to see them, but they are actually still present. Now here are going to be a couple things that are special to the fishes. So cartilaginous fish and bony fish are going to have something called a lateral line system. And this is going to kind of allow for these fish to detect minor vibrations in the water. So this is going to both help with predators trying to catch their prey. So if you think about a shark, if a shark feels some movement with its lateral line system, it can then go try to catch whatever that is. So if it's another fish, it can go try to catch it and eat it. Some other fish, such as like some bony fish, they are going to be the prey item. And so their lateral line system is actually going to help them detect any predators around. Obviously some fish are also going to eat other fish, and so they'll need a lateral line system to detect prey or predators. But regardless, it's going to help them detect movement in the water. Bony fish are also going to have this extra structure called the operculum, which is a flap of kind of skin that is going to cover the area that has the gills. Okay, so this is you've probably seen this gill flap. You probably have not called it the operculum, but this is going to help kind of protect that very important gill structure, which is how they're going to actually extract oxygen from the water. And they also have something called a swim bladder, which is a structure that can be filled with gas, and it helps them be buoyant so they don't continuously sink to the bottom of the ocean. So now we've talked about the fish, and both of those, their major kind of innovation was that there were jaws. Now we're going to move on to our next major evolutionary step, which is going to be the evolution of legs. So if we look at fish don't have legs, they can't walk. And so we're now going to kind of move to our first group that are going to have what we call legs. So kind of have these different types of structures for locomotion. And we're going to start to talk about this transition from water to land. Okay, and legs are going to be a really important kind of innovation that's going to allow for that to happen. So our first group that we're going to talk about kind of that has this new innovation of legs are going to be the amphibians. Okay, and so here we have just a diverse group of amphibians. When you think amphibian, I want you to think of organisms that are tied to the water, but also can potentially be on land. Okay, so there's going to be this kind of group that are kind of straddling this area between water and land. Okay, because you can't just have a step from being purely aquatic to purely terrestrial. You have to have kind of an intermediate step, and the class Amphibia is going to fill this intermediate step. So amphibians are going to have this mixture of aquatic and terrestrial adaptations. Many amphibians must be near water and need to keep their skin very moist, and they're going to all need water for reproduction. Okay? They have to have water for reproduction because their eggs do not have shells like a chicken egg that we're used to. Okay, so frog eggs will dry out immediately if they are laid anywhere other than the water. And so they have to be in the water, otherwise we'll have kind of dehydration of the egg. Now, an interesting thing that happens with amphibians is they will go under metamorphosis. So they tend to start off as this aquatic stage where they're something like a tadpole, or you can call it a larva, so it's an early stage. And they will then go through different kind of iterations and kind of lead to this typically a terrestrial adult. Okay, not all adults are going to be terrestrial because there are going to be some groups that have to be in the water at all times, but most of them are going to have the adult version be more terrestrial. So here is a GIF showing kind of the metamorphosis from tadpole to frog. As you can see, we start off as kind of something that does not have limbs, and then finally we get to what a full-grown frog would be with its 4 limbs that are going to allow it to be on land. So here's a little bit of amphibian diversity. So we have a picture of frog eggs, and then a tadpole. We then have a couple different groups. We have an adult tree frog, a Malayan horned frog, and a Texas barred tiger salamander. Okay, so all of these are going to kind of contribute to our amphibian diversity. Now, I said one of the major developments in the amphibians is kind of this move to land, and we're going to start to talk about the legs. So it's thought that kind of amphibians are going to be descendants from fish that had lungs. Okay, so instead of using gills like most fish do, they're going to start to have lungs that are able to extract oxygen from the atmosphere directly. And they're going to have fins with muscles that are going to be strong enough to support kind of movement on land. The first terrestrial, what we call amphibians, are going to be extremely clumsy and not very good at walking. But through the process of evolution, you can see this development of kind of a better mechanism for moving on land, which ultimately are the 4 limbs. Okay, so the terrestrial vertebrates, the amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, are all going to be part of a group called the tetrapods. The word tetra means 4 and pod means foot. So this means 4 foot or 4 feet. Okay, so these individuals are going to have 4 limbs, and initially they're all going to be what we consider feet. Okay, once we get to other groups like us, we then are going to start to have modifications to our 4 limbs, which they're going to be arms. They're going to develop hands. They're going to be different and not necessarily used for locomotion like they evolved initially to be used for. If you look at the fossil record, you can actually see kind of the chronological steps that take place between this. So you can see fish that are purely aquatic, and then you can start to see some fish that have slightly modified fins that look like they would have been used for terrestrial locomotion, and you can then see kind of the development of actual limbs and not fins at all. So here is kind of what a very early amphibian would look like. So we have a fossil of this group, and then we have a reconstruction of what this organism would look like. This kind of looks like a interesting looking alligator, but it would be some type of organism like this with kind of short, stubby legs. Probably would not be very quick, but much better at walking on land than something like a fish. Okay, and again, the tetrapods are going to include amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So all of these are going to have 4 limbs. So legs are going to be our major kind of development for the amphibians, but our next big advancement is going to be the development of the amniotic egg. And this is going to be the last major structure that is going to kind of allow for complete emancipation from the water. So you no longer have to be in the water for reproduction. The reptiles and the mammals are going to have the amniotic egg, which allows them to cut their ties with water and allows them to reproduce on land completely. So we're now going to talk about class Reptilia, and the reptiles are going to include snakes, lizards, turtles, crocodiles, alligators, and birds. So birds are going to be the descendants of a group of dinosaurs and thus are included in class Reptilia. They used to be in their own class called class Aves, but based on many types of evidence, lines of evidence, they have been now reclassified as reptiles, so class reptiles. The reptiles are going to have 2 adaptations to living on land. The first is that they're going to have this scaled waterproof skin that's going to prevent dehydration. So think about the organisms we just talked about, the amphibians. So they're tied to the water, they need it for reproduction, but if you've ever held a frog or a salamander, you notice that their skin is really moist and kind of slimy. But then if you've held a lizard or a snake, they have very dry skin. And it's a really important difference because the reptiles are going to live in places where they're not going to always have access to water. So any water that they consume or have inside their body needs to stay in their body. Okay? If they did not have the scaled waterproof skin, then all the body would evaporate from them and they would be dehydrated. Okay, and so the skin is going to help protect against this dehydration. Now the second really important adaptation is going to be the amniotic egg. Now both reptiles, birds, and mammals are all going to be what we call amniotes. So they're going to have kind of this amniotic structure. It's going to be slightly different in some of the mammals because we don't lay eggs externally. But if we're talking about the reptiles and the birds, they're going to produce amniotic eggs, which are going to be fluid-filled and are going to have these waterproof shells. So when you think of an amniotic egg, think of a chicken egg. So that is going to have kind of this harder shell on the outside that's going to prevent dehydration. Okay, so inside it's going to have kind of the nutrition that's needed for the development of an embryo, and then it's ready to kind of hatch. The amniotic egg, you can think of it as acting as a self-contained pond. So it maintains the correct water level, and it's going to enable these organisms to kind of complete the embryonic stage on land. So here we have an amniotic egg, and it's going to have kind of an outer structure called the shell that's going to help make sure the egg doesn't dehydrate. There's going to be albumin, which is this egg white that's going to be nutrients and water, a yolk, and also kind of an amnion-filled sac around the embryo, all helping protect the embryo so that it can develop into kind of whatever it's going to become. So if it's going to be a chicken, you can have a little baby chick, or if it's going to be a snake, that will then develop. So here we have a little bit of diversity shown. We have an example of a lizard, crocodile, bird, dinosaur, and snake. Lots of different types of reptiles, a very interesting group. So many of the non-bird reptiles are going to be called cold-blooded, which is not a technical term, but this refers to the fact that they do not use their metabolism to control their body temperature like mammals or birds. So we humans are going to regulate our body temperature, and it's a fairly high body temperature due to our high metabolic rate. So we're burning a lot of calories, we're making sure that we stay at the same temperature. Now, most reptiles are actually going to be what we call ectotherms, because they're going to kind of absorb external heat from their environment rather than generate their own. Okay, so what they would do is, you probably have seen lizards do this, is they will actually go out into the environment and seek places that are very warm or in direct sunlight. They will absorb that sunlight energy to help warm up their body, and that will then be kind of how they are going to maintain their body temperature. And so it's going to be pretty variable depending on where they are in the environment. Now, because they do not use their metabolic processes as a way to keep their body temperatures warm, they actually don't need as much food as something like a bird or a mammal. So they will survive on less than 10% of what would be needed for a similarly sized mammal. So if you have a lizard and a mouse is going to need a much higher amount of food compared to the lizard, because the mouse is going to need to keep a constant body temperature, does not absorb heat from its environment, but a lizard is going to do that. And so they don't eat quite as much as we do. If we go back to the Mesozoic era, reptiles were going to be very numerous and kind of widespread. And dinosaurs were the most diverse reptile group on the planet at that time, and they would have been the largest animals ever to live on land. Now, during kind of the end of the Mesozoic and about 70 million years ago, we kind of are coming to the end of the age of the reptiles. And this is largely because of the climate changing. It became cooler and more variable. And if we go to about 66 million years ago, we then have the Cretaceous mass extinction, which is when all of the dinosaurs go extinct except for the birds. So this time period that we're talking about, when the dinosaurs are most kind of numerous, is going to be during the Mesozoic era, specifically during the Jurassic period. But once we get to the Cretaceous period, which is kind of this last era of the Mesozoic era, we are then going to have kind of most of the dinosaur lineages become extinct except for the birds. If we look at genetic and fossil evidence, we can see that birds are actually reptiles, and they evolved from a lineage of dinosaurs called the theropods, which were small two-legged dinosaurs. Now, birds have a lot of adaptations that allow them to fly. They have honeycomb bones, which make them very light. So if you've ever seen a bird bone, it has these kind of large holes that makes it kind of more brittle, but it also allows it to be very light so that these birds can be able to fly. They have one ovary instead of a pair of ovaries, again, to lessen their weight so that they can fly. And they also do not have teeth. Anything that weighs them down is going to be problematic for flight. And unlike other reptiles, they're going to be what we call endotherms. Endotherms are going to use their own metabolic heat to maintain a certain body temperature. And so we are endotherms as humans. We maintain a relatively constant body temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so birds are also going to have kind of this metabolic heat that they're going to have that will keep them at a relatively high and constant body temperature. So as we said before, birds are going to be highly adapted for flying. Their bird wing is going to act as the airfoil, which is going to allow for them to be able to fly. They are going to have very large breast muscles that are going to be anchored to a keel bone that allows them to kind of have this powered flight. They have feathers that are made from the same proteins that scales of reptiles are made out of. They're just been modified for flight in this way. We do think that feathers initially evolved for insulation, so keeping the body temperature warmer, but they then kind of had that exaptation where they then have been adapted for a new function. It's also possible that the feathers were for courtship displays. We don't really know exactly what feathers first evolved for, but insulation or courtship displays are kind of two of the big hypotheses. And like we said, the feathers first evolved for some other function, but then were adapted for flight later on. So now we're moving on from the reptiles, and we're going to start to talk about the mammals, which is the group that we're going to be in. And as you can see, mammals are going to have all of these different adaptations that we've talked about today. We have a vertebral column, we have a jaw, we have 4 limbs, and we are going to have an amniotic egg. Now, I absolutely love animals, so you're going to see that I put a lot of pictures of different mammals here. In the upper left corner, we have the capybara, which is the largest rodent on the planet. Pretty cute. We then have next to it on the top a manatee, which is going to be kind of this interesting group. Any mammal that is purely aquatic, like the manatee or a dolphin or a whale, all of those are descendants of terrestrial mammals. And so mammals evolved on land, and then some of them moved back into the water. In the bottom left corner, we have orangutans, which are going to be one of our close relatives. And then we have in the bottom right corner, rhinoceros. Now, there are 2 major lineages of amniotes, and we've talked about one, which are the reptiles. And now we're going to start talking about the mammals. The first mammals are thought to have arose around 200 million years ago, and they were most likely a small nocturnal, which means that they are awake at night, insect eaters. And on the upper right corner, we have kind of a reconstruction of what we think an early mammal would have been. Now, once the dinosaurs go extinct, the mammals become much more diverse, and we can lead to the point where we have the diversity we see today of mammals. Mammals are going to have 2 unique characteristics that they have to have in order to be included within this mammal group. They're going to have mammary glands, which is how the name the mammal came around. And mammary glands are going to produce milk, which is a nutrient-rich substance that feeds the young. And they're also going to have hair. So if you look at any other type of animal outside the mammals, none of them have hair. Okay, they can have feathers, but that's not hair. So hair is going to be a characteristic that's found within this group. So there are 3 major groups of mammals. The first group are the monotremes, and these are the only group that lay eggs. Our second group are the marsupials, and these are all going to have pouches. They also have something called the placentia, which is going to be kind of a mixture of embryonic and maternal tissues. So the embryo is going to be within the mother's uterus, and it is going to receive oxygen and nutrients from the maternal blood flow. The eutherians, which are also called placental mammals, are going to have placentia kind of inside their body for a much longer time than the marsupials will. We'll talk a little bit more about how marsupials actually have this all take place, but eutherians, which is what humans are in, are going to have kind of long gestational periods where the baby is inside, developing, There will then be a birth, and there's going to be this more intimate and long-lasting association between the mother and the developing young. So the monotremes are going to include things like platypus, echidnas, and I don't know about you, but I think this is probably one of the cutest pictures I've ever seen of these little baby platypuses, or platypi. I'm not sure how you say the plural. Here are different marsupials. So we have kangaroos, we have koalas, we have a wallaby, which looks like a smaller version of a kangaroo, and a wombat. Now, the kangaroos are interesting in how they actually have the baby develop. So what happens is that initially we will have the baby start to develop the embryo inside of the womb. Okay. However, after a very short period of time, the baby is actually born, but it's very underdeveloped. So what the baby does is it climbs out and actually will travel all the way up to the pouch and go inside the pouch where there are the nipples. It will then stay in there and suckle off the nipple for a very long period of time and will develop. Okay, so initially starts off as this little naked embryo looking structure and will eventually develop into the baby. So unlike eutherians, like humans, they have a very short internal gestation period, but then they do a lot of their development in the actual pouch. And so on this slide, I actually have a link to a YouTube video that shows how this all happens. It's very bizarre because the baby is born so young and then has to climb without the aid of the mother from, kind of the vaginal opening all the way up to the pouch and find a nipple on its own. It's very bizarre, kind of amazing. And I just wanted to leave you with the marsupials with this baby wombat, which I think a lot of people find this highly disturbing, but I think it's absolutely adorable. So there he is. Eutherian mammals, which are going to include, I think, what we tend to think of what a mammal is. So, humans, elephants, polar bears, things like this. These are going to have kind of this long-lasting association between the mother and her developing young. Okay, and so the baby will be inside gestating or developing for an extended period of time. So in humans, it's about 9 months. In elephants, it's over a year. And so it's going to depend on the group, but it's going to have the majority of the development is going to happen inside the womb. So we're now going to really focus in on the primates because this is the group that we're in. So we're going to talk about different groups of primates and ultimately going to talk about human evolution. Primates are an order within the group Mammalia, and they're going to include Homo sapiens and all of our closest kin. It's thought that primates evolved from an insect-eating mammal that lived during the late Cretaceous around 65 million years ago, which is right around when the dinosaurs went extinct. The very first primates are thought to have been small and arboreal, which means that they lived in trees. It is thought that because primates lived in trees, they were shaped by natural selection through the demands of living in the trees. So having different types of limbs and hands ultimately that are able to allow them to traverse in the tree canopy is going to be really important. Some of the traits that evolved due to living in trees included having limber shoulder joints that were able to allow for swinging from branch to branch, so having very kind of flexible shoulder joints. Having eyes that were close together on the front of the face. This allows for an overlapping field of vision and creates an enhanced depth perception. So if you are trying to kind of tell how far away a branch is, you're going to need to have really good depth perception. Primates have excellent hand-eye coordination, and they're going to have extensive parental care. And so that's one of the things that kind of is very important in this group are extensive maternal care, usually maternal care, for the primates. And mammals are going to devote a lot of energy to caring for the young, more than kind of most other vertebrates. And within the primates, they're going to be some of the most attentive parents of all mammals. It's not to say that there aren't some mammals that are not primates that aren't attentive, but the primates seem to be one of the most attentive groups. And in this image, we have a fabulous red-shanked duke. That's what it's called. So here is some of the primate diversity, and we're actually going to talk about these different groups. The primates are divided into three main groups. This first group is going to include primates that live in Madagascar, Southern Asia, and Africa, and they're going to include the lemurs, the lorises, and the bush babies. And you can see lemurs on the top picture. We then have lorises, and then bush baby is the very bottom picture. The next group are the tarsiers, which are small nocturnal tree dwellers that are only found in Southeast Asia. Okay, and so this is going to comprise the second group of primates. They're kind of really interesting looking with these huge eyes. The last group are going to be the anthropoids, and these are going to include the monkeys and the apes. So the anthropoids are going to be the group that we're in. They are going to have fully opposable thumbs, and what an opposable thumb means is that you can touch, the tip of your thumb to each of your other fingers, and it allows for us to be able to manipulate lots of different things. So we are able to text on our phones, or make jewelry, or perform surgery. Our hands are going to be very important, and our opposable thumbs are going to be very important in this. So our closest anthropoid relatives are going to be the non-human apes that include the gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. And all of these are going to live in tropical regions of the Old World. So this is going to include places like Africa and Asia. You don't really find non-human apes in Europe, but that would also be part of the Old World. Now, all of these can live in trees, and some of them will kind of sleep in trees, but only the gibbons and orangutans are primarily arboreal. The rest of them are going to live on the ground. Gorillas and chimpanzees are going to have very highly social interactions and groups. And the apes are also going to have larger brains than if you look at the monkeys. Kind of brain to body size is going to be very different, where apes are going to have a much larger brain for their body size than the monkeys would. This is thought to allow for more adaptable behavior. Okay, and the apes are going to include the humans. So I love gorillas, and I love baby gorillas, and so I just wanted to do a picture collage of adorable baby gorillas. I don't know if you guys think they're cute, but here they are. It's so interesting how similar they are to us. Obviously, we're distantly related, but how the babies look so similar to our human babies and our interactions. And if you've ever watched any kind of maternal behavior of a gorilla mom with her baby, it looks very human-like and very caring, and kind of just shows this connection between us and our close relatives. So here is the primate phylogeny. And we are not talking about a lot of these, so we didn't mention anything about the monkeys. We mainly talked about the anthropoids, the apes. But on here you can see kind of the ancestral primate species. The lorises, lemurs, and bush babies are the furthest kind of removed from humans. We then have the tarsiers, and then we have the group that's going to be the anthropoids, which includes the monkeys, both New World and Old World monkeys, and then the apes, which is going to be the group that we are found in. Now, when we start to make the connections between humans and chimpanzees and other apes, this starts to lead to some major misconceptions that are sometimes still present in people's thinking. Okay, so if we look at the fossil record in molecular systematics, this is going to indicate that humans are very closely related to chimpanzees, and they shared a common ancestor in Africa for all but the last 6 to 7 million years. Okay, so we are not descendants of chimpanzees. They are our relatives. They are close relatives, but we are on different trajectories, different paths, but we did share a common ancestor. So misconceptions about human evolution persist, and one of these is that if chimpanzees were our ancestors, then why do they still exist? Okay, and so again, scientists do not think that humans evolved from chimpanzees. We think that we evolved from a common ancestor that then branched off and led to chimpanzees, and another one that branched off and led to humans. So present-day humans and chimpanzees diverged from a common ancestor several million years ago. Now, because of Darwin's kind of thoughts about common ancestry, many people drew him as kind of this monkey man or ape man, kind of making fun of this idea, say like, how can we be related to monkeys or descended from monkeys, which we're not. But this site, you even hear it like, well, I'll be a monkey's uncle or something like that. That all has to come from this idea of kind of misconceptions about how we're related to chimpanzees. Another misconception about human evolution is that it was kind of like a ladder, a series of steps, and you see this top image, which is a very kind of prevalent image where you have kind of the steps that led to a human, but we think that human evolution was extremely complicated, and it was not a ladder. There wasn't just kind of a series of steps that led from an ancestral anthropoid to a Homo sapiens. It actually was very, very kind of messy, and we still really don't know everything about human evolution. So many times there were multiple hominin species, which hominin is going to then be kind of a closer, the family that humans are in, and they would coexist at the same time. So again, this is showing that it's not a ladder step, but that there are multiple kind of iterations of these human-like groups that were living at the same time. So instead of thinking of human evolution as a ladder, think of it as a multi-branched bush, where kind of ultimately one of the branches is going to lead to humans, but there are lots of other branches that have kind of human-like groups as well. So here is showing kind of different groups and kind of the time period that they would have overlapped. These are going to be all based on fossils. So obviously we don't need fossils for Homo sapiens, but any of the other groups that are kind of in this group are going to need to have some fossil evidence. And so we're going to see Homo neanderthalis, we're going to have Homo erectus, these groups that are going to sometimes coexist with humans. We're now going to explore the human lineage by looking at different members of this group. So the first member of the human lineage we're going to look at is Australopithecus, and this is going to be the first group that are going to be bipedal. Now, bipedalism is the ability to walk on two limbs and walk upright. And this is a clear difference that we see between humans and our closest relatives that are still living, the chimpanzees. Another big difference between the chimpanzees and humans is that we have much larger brains. Now, this led to some kind of theorizing on what came first. Do we have large brains first and then become bipedal, or were we bipedal and then have larger brains? Well, in the 1900s, scientists hypothesized that increase in brain size was probably the initial change that kind of separated hominins from the other apes. However, this was overturned when a group of researchers found a 3.24 million year old female hominin that had a small brain and walked on two legs. Therefore, this fossil is showing that a larger brain did not need to evolve first before bipedalism did. And here we have kind of some images of what Australopithecus are supposed to look like. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about this female hominin that's 3.24 million years old because she's pretty famous. Now this important fossil that was found was named Lucy. So she is an Australopithecus afarensis, and she is 3.24 million years old. She was about 3 feet tall and had the head the size of a softball, so very small little hominid. Now, with the actual skeleton, there was evidence of bipedalism based on the wear of the bones. They also, from the same time period, have trace fossils, which are footprints that were left in volcanic ash. Okay, and so this was showing kind of how, this wasn't Lucy's footprints, but during the same time period, there are the footprints of a bipedal organism. Okay, here are some of the pictures of the footprints. Okay, and so because of the orientation, they can tell that this was made by a bipedal organism. Okay, so since this discovery, there have been many more Australopithecus found, and one of them is a three-year-old member that has almost a complete skeleton. Here we have two reconstructions of what it's thought that Australopithecus would look like, including a picture with some footprints. Now, the footprints are very important for this group because they show the type of locomotion that this group is going to be doing. So instead of walking kind of hunched over on two legs, but with your front arms kind of on the ground as well, you have fully bipedalism, which means that they're walking like humans would. Not necessarily completely the same, but similar. And so what we have here is kind of this discovery site of these ancient footprints. So they're found in Ethiopia. And then a kind of reconstruction of what a footprint for a human looks like. And then on the bottom, this Latoli, which is where the fossil footprints are found, what this footprint sort of looks like. And it's very similar to what we see in humans. In Australopithecus, we saw bipedalism arise. And now we're going to start looking at the brain. So the first kind of evidence of the enlargement of the brain happens in fossils from East Africa dating back to 2.4 million years ago. And this is a really important step because we think of humans as being very intelligent, and that comes from having a large brain. So we think that instead of having a large brain first and bipedalism second, it's now thought that bipedalism evolved first, and a few millions after that, we have the evolution of a larger brain. And this group that we're going to be looking at is Homo habilis. Now, the brains of Homo habilis are not going to be the size of what we see in humans of today, but they are intermediate between Australopithecus size brain and Homo sapiens. Now, along with this increased skull size and brain capability, we also start to see the first evidence of handmade stone tools. And so it's thought that these large-brained fossils would be able to have the capacity to create tools. And they are called Homo habilis because this stands for the handyman. So Homo habilis is thought to be the first group to start to use handmade tools. And so we could see in this image reconstruction of kind of Homo habilis creating a stone, kind of using another stone as a tool and trying to chip away. And they've done lots of research into kind of these tools and making sure that they're not made just by natural, breakage points, but they are intentionally created by some type of human-like group, and in this case, it would be Homo habilis. So our previous two groups, we see bipedalism forming, and we also see increased brain size. And this next group we're going to talk about, which are Homo erectus, they're going to be the first dispersers, and they're going to leave Africa and start to venture into other areas of the planet. Homo erectus, the name means upright human. And this was the first species to be found outside of Africa, and they did this about 1.8 million years ago. They were taller and had an even larger brain capacity than Homo habilis, And they migrated to different areas, including Asia and parts of Europe. And they moved as far as Indonesia. It's thought that with this increased brain size, their intelligence would have increased as well. And this is important because leaving Africa, kind of their place where they evolved, requires intelligence. You have to be able to deal with colder climates of the north, be able to navigate. And so it's thought that Homo erectus would have this capability. We also see more sophisticated tools being produced at this time with this group. Here we have some different Homo erectus fossils and a reconstruction of a Homo erectus boy named Turkana boy. He is approximately 1.5 million years old, and he was found to have almost a complete skeleton, and he was found in Kenya. They think he was about 9 years old and already 1.6 meters tall, which would have been taller than Lucy would have been found. But here we can see some of the kind of skull and the different bones, and also some of the tools that they would have used. And as you can see from Turkana boy, this does look different from humans, but we're much more human-like in this figure. Here's a reconstruction of what Homo erectus may have looked like. They probably used fire and definitely had tools they would use for hunting and then also kind of dealing with the carcass to get the meat. Our next group are Homo neanderthalis, and they are going to be kind of this group that definitely overlapped with Homo sapiens because we know that we can find Neanderthal DNA in modern day humans. They have a large brain. They hunted big game and made tools from stone and wood. Okay? They lived in Europe as much as 350,000 years ago. So we know that you could start to find Neanderthals back then, and they kind of spread throughout Near East, Central Asia, and Southern Siberia, but by 39,000 years ago, they were extinct. So they definitely kind of moved around. But at that point, 39,000 years ago, we no longer see evidence of Neanderthals other than what's found in our DNA. We have an image of a skeleton, and we also have some kind of carvings in stone and also another tool. And if you look at this kind of reconstruction of what a Neanderthal looks like, again, very human-like. Because of the very similar characteristics that Homo neanderthalis had to humans, it was thought for a period of time that potentially Homo neanderthalis were actually the ancestors of humans. But once they extracted DNA from some Neanderthal fossils, they found that humans are not descendants of Neanderthals. However, they did share a common ancestor, and they think that the lineages kind of diverged about 400,000 years ago. And here we have kind of an image of a reconstructed Neanderthal. Again, very human-like, slight different, kind of a heavier brow, but we can definitely see ourselves in this close relative. So once they have done the Neanderthal genome, they found that interbreeding between Neanderthals and in some populations of Homo sapiens did happen, and we can actually see that in our genes. So roughly 2% of the genomes of most present-day humans come from Neanderthals. Now this excludes Africans. Africans did not interbreed with Neanderthals because Neanderthals only lived in Europe. And so you will not see any detectable trace of Neanderthal ancestry with Africans. Scientists also have discovered that they think that some Neanderthals were pale-skinned with red hair. And the reason they were able to figure that out is by looking at the actual genes and seeing kind of some similarities to humans. And here is a link to a video that you can watch about Neanderthal DNA. I want to mention two other human relatives. What I want to just mention is that things are constantly changing, and they're finding new fossils, and they're realizing that they are not the same species that we already knew about. So this is Homo naledi, and it is a recently discovered human relative. So we have kind of bones from several different skeletons here and some partial skulls. And by using different technology, they can actually kind of reconstruct what they think this human relative would have looked like. Another new species that was recently discovered in the Philippines, we have both dental, so we can see their teeth, and also this is kind of a foot bone. This is going to add a new branch to the human evolutionary tree, and this one is called Homo luzonensis, which again has just recently been found in the Philippines. Now we get to Homo sapiens, which is our own species. So some of the oldest fossils for Homo sapiens were discovered in Ethiopia, and these fossils date back to 160,000 to 195,000 years ago. Now, if we look at the DNA, it suggests that all living humans can trace our ancestry back to a single African Homo sapien lineage. Okay, and so that would have began around 160,000 to 200,000 years ago. Okay, so this idea that Africa, parts of Africa are kind of the cradle of humanity is supported by this genetic evidence. So here we have a reconstruction of an early modern human. This man was about 175 centimeters tall and was in his 50s. And one striking thing you're going to notice is that he actually has kind of tattoo on his body. Now, we're unsure if this is actually permanent, but we do think that body modification is something that is very ancient and can be found on the preserved skins of some very ancient ancestors of ours. So one thing we know about humans is that we have dispersed and covered the globe. And so we think that there were multiple waves of humans leaving Africa and spreading out first into Asia and then into Europe, finally Southeast Asia, Australia, and then arriving in the New World, which is North and South America. Now, when humans arrived to the New World is very controversial, and there is not really a known date. There's lots of different evidence that kind of shows it could be much earlier than we thought, but at a minimum, it's thought that humans arrived in the New World around 15,000 years ago. And here we have kind of a skull from a fossil Homo sapien and also more sophisticated tools. And we have a video on here that talks about the human evolution. So this map shows kind of relative times of when we think humans reach different areas of the globe. So again, life for humans is thought to have evolved in Africa, specifically in the Rift Valley, which is what we call the cradle of humanity. And then from there, we have different individuals moving to different parts of Africa, but also then moving into the Middle East, moving over to Asia and to Europe, Australia, and then sometime between 15,000 to 35,000 years ago, went over to North America and South America. During this time period, there would have been a land bridge that would have connected what is Russia and now Alaska. So there would have been the Bering Sea land bridge, so they could have moved over and not had to necessarily take a boat. Although we do think that sea travel was something that was happening pretty long ago. One thing that scholars have always asked is what makes humans different. And there are a couple different traits that humans have that we think were important for the development of human societies. So one thing is that in the primates, the brain is going to continue to grow after birth. But in humans, it's going to grow for a longer period of time. This then is going to lengthen the amount of time that we are with our parents, and we require kind of parental care. And during this time, what can happen is that while we're growing, we can also pass along culture. Okay, and so this is going to be the social transmission of knowledge. So kind of way to talk about different customs and beliefs, art, all through kind of communication, through language, through stories. And humans have evolved culturally as well as biologically. So yes, we have evolved. There are different things that are continuously evolving, but our culture is something that evolves a lot as well. So if we look at Homo sapiens, there are no other species on the planet that has impacted the Earth like we have. We have something called cultural evolution, which has allowed for us to basically change the history of life. We are a species that can defy any of our physical limitations. So we can fly, we can go really fast in cars, we can go into space, we can do all these things that would not be necessarily physically possible with just our bodies. But because our brain has this enormous capacity to invent and create, we can defy the physical limitations. Okay? We don't have to wait to adapt to our environment. We can adapt our environment to us. We have planted plants so that we can have a steady food source. We have changed the pathways of water. We have vaccinations that can help increase our ability to deal with different pathogens. So we do not wait until kind of, survive our natural selection to take place. We can actually change things on our own. Now, culture that we've mentioned is going to be really important. So again, this is the social transmission of accumulated knowledge, customs, and beliefs in art over generations. And so this is normally going to be through language, but it's not always going to be language. Cultural evolution has had three major stages. If we look at humans, the first were nomads who were hunter-gatherers. They made tools, they organized communal activities, they divided labor, and they created art. Okay, so this is kind of our first major stage of human life. Okay. Art has always been a really important part of human life, and these are very old cave drawings that we can see, mostly depicting animals, but also kind of depicting the human itself. We can see these handprints that we think different, ancient ancestors made. The second major stage in the cultural evolution of humans was the development of agriculture, and this happened about 10 to 15,000 years ago in Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas. After this second main stage, which lasted for a long period of time, we get to the third stage, which was the Industrial Revolution. And this was a time when we started to industrialize our world, started using fossil fuels as an energy source, and ultimately started to really change our planet. Humans have changed the planet that we live on. We have driven many species to extinction. We have changed the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've had some positive impacts as well. But again, we can defy our physical limitations. We can go deep into the ocean, up into space. We can shortcut biological evolution, and we can change the environment to meet our needs. We can take down an entire forest and plant what we want to plant there. Here we see some of the impacts of humans on the planet. We can see forests that have been completely taken down and replaced with agricultural crops. We can see dumps and the fossil fuels that we use to power our cars and all of our electricity. And we see oceans that are filled with plastics and fishing lines that have been left there. And we have also kind of messed up different waterways by having agricultural waste go into things like the Gulf of Mexico, which create these dead zones. Now, we've done a lot of destruction to the planet, but we also have the brain and the capabilities to change and make these things better. So hopefully this new generation that's coming up will try to help alleviate some of the problems that were created from the past. On this last slide, I have a video that shows the 7 million years of human evolution kind of condensed within less than 10 minutes. And so you can watch it and see kind of different human relatives that were present throughout this time. You will only need to know the specifics about the groups that I talked about: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, and obviously Homo sapiens.